Red and blue lights flashed desperately against the ornate wrought iron gates of the Clear Springs Estates that fateful night, but the shrill siren screams went unanswered for what felt like an eternity. Behind those gates lay a man in dire need of help, his breath growing shallow with each passing second. The ambulance, forced to wait because of an argument over a gate fee, never made it through in time. Now, a once peaceful neighborhood faces a storm of legal scrutiny and moral outrage that nobody ever imagined possible. Despite its idyllic name and neatly trimmed hedges, the Clear Springs Estates community was known among locals for its high walls, private security patrols, and a notoriously stubborn homeowners association. In truth, living there sometimes felt less like a sanctuary and more like stepping onto the set of a strict private club, rules piled upon bylaws and further complicated by petty regulations. For years, the residents brushed off the heavier-handed parts of the HOA's approach. After all, property values were rumored to rise a few more points each year, and in that area, appearances were everything. No one suspected that those rigid policies could escalate to a life-and-death scenario. Yet, in the early hours of a warm June evening, that's exactly what happened. When paramedics arrived at the gate, they found it shut tight. According to the entry guard, an older man named Earl who took his job far more seriously than even the HOA guidelines recommended. An additional service charge was mandated before any non-contracted emergency vehicles could be let into the complex. Whether it was a misunderstanding or a strict adherence to the letter of a flawed rule, the end result was tragic. The ambulance could not enter until the fee was settled or a release code was given. By the time the payment dispute was resolved and the gates finally swung open, a valuable 9 minutes had passed. That was 9 minutes too long. The victim, a 57-year-old resident named Paul Gregg, had collapsed from what was later determined to be a ruptured aneurysm. Moments mattered, and the medical team needed immediate access to stabilize him. Instead, they were stonewalled by rules, red tape, and an inflexible system. In the aftermath, tearful neighbors recalled Paul as a gentle figure who loved to volunteer at the nearby youth center. He was the last person you would expect to stir controversy. And yet, even in death, he had sparked a full-blown community reckoning. That same night, as police lights mingled with the ambulance's glow, local journalist Teresa Liu hurried to the scene. The phone tip she'd received promised an almost unbelievable headline: paramedics blocked by HOA during medical emergency. Hardly anyone in the city had ever heard of such an incident. But for Teresa, who had covered countless human interest stories, the real shock came when she spoke to the on-duty paramedics. Their faces were still flushed with anger and frustration. "I can't believe they tried to make us pay a gate fee," said one of them, sweat still beading along his brow. "We explained it was an emergency, but the guard insisted he had strict orders." Teresa scribbled in her notepad, her instincts telling her there was a bigger story than just a misunderstanding. She asked around, but most residents had locked their doors in fear of the spectacle. Few wanted to be seen gossiping about the powerful HOA. However, Mrs. Jenkins, an elderly woman who often walked her Dalmatian around the block, mustered the courage to speak up. She had lived there for 15 years, a widow who quietly went about her daily routine. That night, she stood weeping in her doorway. "I saw them from my window," she whispered, voice trembling. "Saw the flashing lights and realized they weren't coming in. I begged Earl to open the gate, but he just waved me off. HOA policy," he said. It was horrifying. Paul Gregg died on the way to the hospital, never regaining consciousness. By the end of that grim night, rumor had it that the HOA president, a woman named Cynthia Shapiro, was already on an emergency conference call with the other board members, trying to decide how best to manage the optics. Whether that rumor was true or not, the next morning's local news headlines catapulted the story into the public eye. HOA fees delay ambulance response. Resident dead. The Clear Springs Estates board scrambled to craft a response, but their carefully worded press release about reviewing certain policies only fueled the anger. The official statement also placed significant blame on the security guard for misunderstanding protocol, deflecting focus from the fact that the board itself instituted the gate fee rule in the first place. In an era where many community HOAs often hold more sway than local municipal governments, people in neighboring towns began to question how something so trivial, a gate fee, could override a life-saving emergency response. Lawsuits were hinted at, but no one was quite sure what shape they'd take or how far they could go. After all, HOAs operate in a murky legal space with private rules that sometimes directly contradict public interests. 2 weeks later, the Gregg family lawyer, Malcolm Spencer, announced they would be filing a negligence suit against the Clear Springs Estates Board of Directors. By that point, the entire city was buzzing with speculation. Some supported the Gregg family wholeheartedly, claiming this was a travesty of basic human decency. Others worried about what implications such a suit might have for all HOAs nationwide. Could every homeowners association be held criminally responsible for obstructing emergency services? The conversation ballooned as newscasters debated the fine line between property rights and public safety. In the eye of this media storm were Paul's grieving children and a deeply divided community. No matter where residents stood on the issue, nobody could ignore that night's tragic lesson. Sometimes, rules can kill just as surely as a bullet if applied with enough stubbornness and disregard for human life. In the days after Paul's death, Clear Springs Estates felt like a ghost town, though the day-to-day hum of landscaping crews and pool maintenance persisted. It was a surreal backdrop to what became a hive of legal and media activity. Vans from local television networks camped outside the gated entrance, setting up cameras to record every passing car, hoping to catch residents' reactions. Whenever a local stepped out, they were assailed with reporters' questions. Most either refused to comment or uttered a quick, "no comment," talk to our HOA. The tension hung in the air like a dense fog, and the sound of hushed whispers replaced the friendly greetings that once filled the sidewalks. Perhaps no one felt the weight of the tragedy more than Angela Gregg, Paul's daughter. Angela had flown in from out of state the very next morning, disembarking from her red-eye flight still in disbelief that her father was gone. She was immediately thrust into the center of a swirl of sympathy, outrage, and practicalities, arranging a funeral, dealing with her father's affairs, and now, spearheading the lawsuit. At 32 years old, Angela was no stranger to adversity. She'd worked her way through college and took care of her ailing mother during her teenage years. But nothing prepared her for the heartbreak of losing her dad in such a preventable way. She sat in her father's living room, the air heavy with the scent of old books and stale coffee. Framed photos of Paul in better times lined the mantel. Vacations in the mountains, neighborhood barbecues, his proud stance next to Angela at her college graduation. The living room, once a warm hub of laughter, now felt like a mausoleum. Angela clutched a stack of papers, documents from the coroner, hospital discharge forms, and a copy of the ambulance service's incident report. Words like delayed response and obstruction of emergency services glared back at her in black and white. Her father's lawyer, Malcolm Spencer, had just finished explaining the complicated legal path ahead. They would pursue negligence charges, but it could also evolve into a wrongful death suit. We have to prove that the HOA's policy directly led to Paul's inability to receive timely care, Malcolm explained, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. Believe me, Angela, you have a strong case. But HOAs have historically been tough to fight. They'll argue the guard misunderstood, that the official policy was never meant to apply to emergency vehicles, and so on. Outside, the hazy morning sun lit up the front lawn, where a single black ribbon was tied around the mailbox in memory of Paul. Angela stared at that ribbon, tears welling up. "This can't just be about money," she whispered. "I need to make sure this never happens to another family again." Later that afternoon, Angela met with a local civil rights advocate named Ray Johnson. Ray had gained prominence in the city for taking on controversial housing cases, from predatory landlords to discriminatory zoning laws. In a small office overlooking the main boulevard, Ray laid out the broader significance of the Gregg family struggle. "You'd be surprised how often HOAs overstep their bounds," she said, leaning over her cluttered desk. "What happened to your father is appalling. It's an extreme example, but it showcases a growing problem. Many of these associations operate as mini-governments, but they don't have the same oversight. Angela nodded, her resolve strengthening. She remembered her father's own frustrations with the board. He'd once been slapped with a fine for having his garbage bin outside an hour before pickup time. Another time, they'd threatened to penalize him for planting rose bushes in an unapproved shade of pink. It seemed ridiculous at the time, but she'd shrugged it off, thinking it was just how these places functioned. Now she realized just how damaging unchecked power could become. Meanwhile, in another part of the neighborhood, the HOA board held an emergency meeting behind closed doors. More than a dozen faces surrounded a polished oak table, their expressions uneasy. Cynthia Shapiro, the president, presided at the head with the demeanor of a monarch in crisis. She wore her impeccably pressed blazer and had her hair pulled back in a tight bun. She cleared her throat. "We need to establish a clear narrative," she began, trying to rein in the anxious chatter. Earl was not following protocol. That much is certain. She then shot a glance toward a silver-haired man who oversaw security protocols. "We must also remind everyone that we have never required fees for emergency services." This was a misunderstanding, plain and simple. But not everyone in that room was buying the spin. One board member, a retired insurance executive named Arthur Gray, had been quietly uncomfortable with the direction of the HOA for months. He'd often found the stringent fines and heavy-handed approaches troubling. That night's fiasco weighed on him. He tentatively raised his voice. Even if it was a misunderstanding, we all knew Earl's personality. He's by the book to an extreme. We set these policies, and we gave him the authority to enforce them. We can't just pretend we bear no responsibility. The room fell silent, the usual tension of dissent rearing its head. Cynthia's face tightened, but she kept her composure. "We will cooperate with any investigation," she said, "but our focus right now is supporting the Gregg family through this tragic event. That is our official stance." Those were her words, but her tone suggested something else entirely. Damage control, pure and simple. Beyond the manicured lawns, the city was on edge. Talk radio hosts debated the morality and legality of HOAs charging fees to essential services. A wave of condemnation crashed down on Clear Springs estates, from neighbors and strangers alike. Social media exploded with rants and horror stories about overzealous associations. "This is the future if we keep letting HOAs run wild," one viral post read. Another retorted, "Why can't paramedics just break down a gate in an emergency? The system is broken." In that maelstrom of blame and heartbreak, Angela steadied herself. If there was one thing her dad taught her, it was that perseverance in the face of adversity was crucial. She might have to stand up against a well-funded HOA and its small army of lawyers, but she would not back down. The question that remained, what dirty secrets would come to light once they dug deeper into the board's dealings? And would it matter to a court of law, or would the Clear Springs estates simply absorb the blow and carry on as always? For Angela, failure wasn't an option. She believed wholeheartedly that the last gift she could give her father was a promise, to fight for justice, to expose the callousness that cost him his life, and to ensure no other ambulance would ever be turned away from those iron gates again. Angela's lawsuit quickly became the talk of the region. Legal analysts speculated on local TV channels that a negligence claim against an HOA could set precedent on a national scale, especially if it included a wrongful death component. Within weeks, lawyers from out of state began contacting Angela, offering their services pro bono to take on the overreaching HOA. Malcolm Spencer, already experienced in property disputes, realized that with so many eager legal experts vying for the case, Angela could potentially assemble a dream team. But Angela wasn't looking for fame or money. All she wanted was accountability. While the media coverage raged, the Clear Springs Estates board found themselves in an unenviable position. Their usual approach of controlling the narrative through polished newsletters and carefully moderated community forums crumbled under intense public scrutiny. Nervous residents also began to question whether their property values would plummet. "Did the board's stubbornness ruin our investment?" they asked among themselves. The once coveted gate that symbolized exclusivity now seemed like a cursed monument. Nobody wanted to be associated with a place where emergency vehicles were delayed by petty bureaucracy. Torn between public outcry and the need to maintain support within the neighborhood, the board scheduled a community-wide meeting in the clubhouse. They sent out a series of notifications, each more carefully worded than the last. Still, rumors flourished. People whispered that the board was going to throw the security guard under the bus. Others said the board would bribe local officials to kill the investigation. By the time the evening of the meeting arrived, the clubhouse was packed beyond capacity. Tension crackled in the air like static before a thunderstorm. Angela decided to attend, accompanied by Ray Johnson and a small group of neighbors sympathetic to the Gregg family's cause. She took a seat near the front, determined to lock eyes with the board members. She wanted them to understand that she wasn't just a grieving daughter. She was also an informed and determined plaintiff. Her father's memory fueled her resolve. Cynthia Shapiro stepped onto the makeshift podium, flipping through a stack of typed notes. She offered a subdued greeting, trying to convey somber dignity. "We're all here tonight because a tragic event unfolded in our community," she began. "We understand that emotions are running high. On behalf of the entire board, I offer our deepest condolences to the Gregg family." The words sounded scripted and hollow, even to Angela's ears. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, a mix of support, anger, and skepticism. Cynthia continued, "I'd like to clarify that the board never intended to charge emergency responders a fee. We have a policy in place for non-registered vendors, maintenance crews, delivery companies, and the like. Somehow, this policy was misapplied by our security team. While we regret this misunderstanding, it's important to remember the policy itself was not designed for ambulances or any emergency service." A booming voice interrupted from the back of the room. "Then why have I heard about paramedics being hassled before? My neighbor said they had to wait at the gate 6 months ago." Heads turned. A tall, broad-shouldered man stood with crossed arms, face flushed. Cynthia tried to maintain composure, but beads of sweat formed at her temple. Before she could craft a response, another neighbor chimed in, this time a middle-aged woman with short gray hair. "I'm a hospice nurse. I had trouble entering once, was nearly late for a shift with a homebound patient. The guard insisted I wasn't on the approved list and told me to come back during regular business hours to register." Cynthia's face whitened. The crowd grew restless, voices rising. Angela felt the temperature in the room skyrocket as more residents shared their own run-ins with the gate. This was exactly the momentum Angela had hoped for, proof that the gate fee and the zero-tolerance policy wasn't just an isolated oversight. She leaned over to Ray, who nodded in affirmation. This was gold for their case. Trying to regain control, Cynthia banged the gavel, something rarely used outside of official board meetings. The sharp crack echoed through the tense air. "Order, please," she said, half yelling. "We are here to address solutions, not to dwell on hearsay." But the crowd wasn't having it. People continued shouting questions. What about accountability? Why hasn't anyone been fired yet? Are we safe in an emergency? Amid the rising chaos, Arthur Gray rose from his seat among the board members. He cleared his throat, carefully choosing his words. "Look," he said, his voice quivering slightly, "we all know something needs to change. I propose we form an emergency oversight committee, one that reviews all HOA policies for compliance with emergency service needs. We should also suspend the gate fee policy entirely until we can properly vet it." A gasp rippled through the crowd, and Cynthia turned on him, eyes blazing. "Arthur, you know that's not how we do things here," she whispered harshly, forgetting her microphone was still on. Her voice carried across the entire room. A smattering of incredulous laughter erupted in response. Angela realized at that moment the board was fracturing under public pressure. Perhaps the old guard of rule above all else was about to be dismantled. Cynthia's slip made it clear that they were more concerned with how they traditionally operated than with acting swiftly to ensure safety. The cracks in the armor were showing. By the end of the meeting, no concrete action had been taken. The board merely promised to revisit and clarify the policies. They also announced the retirement of Earl from his security post, calling it a long-planned departure, which drew plenty of rolling eyes. Angela left feeling both outraged and oddly hopeful. The board's shell of control was starting to crumble. She could sense the shift. Residents were waking up to the problem, no longer blindly trusting the leadership that had once seemed unassailable. That same night, Angela dialed a number she had been given by a local media contact. It belonged to a longtime HOA employee who wished to remain anonymous. Angela had agreed to meet him in a discreet location to hear what he had to say about the board's inner workings. They chose a diner just outside city limits, away from watchful neighbors or prying journalists. Over a plate of scrambled eggs and toast, the man, sporting a ball cap pulled low over his eyes, revealed that the board had long imposed hidden fees for various services, funneling them into a special fund. Even some of the basic fees for vendor entry were inflated, he said, not to cover any legitimate costs, but to pad certain budgets for the community's extravagances, like the lavish clubhouse renovations. Angela listened, pulse quickening. This wasn't just about a single misunderstanding at the gate. A pattern of prioritizing money over residents' well-being ran deep. By the time she left the diner, she had a renewed sense of mission. Maybe this evidence could help her case, and more importantly, spur a broader call to rein in HOA overreach. All around her, the city lights twinkled, a reminder that life went on even in the face of tragedy. Angela looked up at the sky, recalling her father's laugh and the way he always found a silver lining, no matter how grim the situation. She had to believe that justice could be served, and that the community Paul loved, despite its flaws, could still be made safer for everyone. With each step to her car, she felt her father's presence, guiding her toward the fight ahead. By the time summer reached its peak, Angela's lawsuit was well underway. The district court judge had granted a discovery phase, allowing both sides to gather evidence. While Malcolm Spencer handled the official paperwork, Angela found herself increasingly wrapped up in the mechanics of a legal case, conducting interviews, reviewing HOA bylaws, and meeting with neighbors who had their own harrowing anecdotes. She discovered that many older residents, who had moved to Clear Springs Estates for a serene retirement, were more afraid of the HOA than they'd ever publicly admit. Fines for minuscule infractions, intimidation tactics, and the threat of eviction for not towing the line plagued them. One day, an anonymous envelope appeared in Angela's mailbox. Inside was a USB flash drive labeled, in neat handwriting, financial records. She assumed this was from the same insider she'd met in the diner, or perhaps another disillusioned staff member. When she plugged it in her laptop, her eyes widened. Documents detailing the HOA's income from gate fees, fines, and unforeseen charges were meticulously listed. They painted a clear picture. The HOA had garnered a small fortune from borderline exploitative policies. An even more damning fact emerged. Some line items showed emergency services fee adjustments. Angela couldn't quite decipher the code, but it proved that the board had, at some point, considered or applied fees specifically tied to ambulance or fire truck entries. Her heart raced. This was the smoking gun she needed. Malcolm was equally stunned. They needed to verify the authenticity of the data, but if everything checked out, it could form the bedrock of their negligence case. He immediately arranged a meeting with Ray Johnson and a forensic accountant to confirm the files were legitimate. As it happened, the accountant corroborated it as internal financial data consistent with official HOA records. The possibilities danced in Angela's mind. Her father's death was not just a freak accident arising from a single guard's misunderstanding. It was a direct result of a policy that, in some capacity, existed on the books, something the board was desperate to deny. News of the lawsuit's progress spread. Even beyond Clear Springs Estates, people listened. Radio hosts debated the morality of HOAs. Older couples called in to voice their disdain for the tyranny of these boards, and younger residents, some with college debt and minimal prospects of homeownership, questioned the entire concept of gated communities. It was becoming larger than one man's tragic death. It was about whether private governance had run amok. Yet, not everyone rallied behind Angela. A contingent of residents formed a Save Our Community coalition, spearheaded by none other than Cynthia Shapiro. They argued that Angela's lawsuit threatened to bankrupt the HOA, leading to higher monthly dues for everyone. They stoked fears that Clear Springs Estates would degrade into just another unsafe suburb. Angela was painted as a money-hungry outsider, a vulture swooping in to feed off her father's death. It hurt Angela more deeply than she could admit. She never wanted to wage war on her neighbors. She just wanted them to face the truth. Still, online forums and local gossip columns labeled her everything from immoral opportunist to troublemaker. One evening, Angela decided to attend a social event at the neighborhood park, a barbecue that was usually a highlight of the summer season. Once again, the tension was palpable. Fewer residents attended than in years past, and those who did stuck to small cliques. Arthur Gray was there, walking around cautiously, attempting to greet people and keep the peace. When he spotted Angela, he approached her, his posture hesitant. "I heard about the new evidence," he said softly. "Is it going to ruin us?" She studied his eyes. They weren't the eyes of a corrupt official, but rather a weary man torn between loyalty to a system he once believed in and the realization that the system was broken. "If by U.S., you mean the heart of this community, I don't think so," Angela replied. "But if you mean the board as it's currently run, then yes, it might. Policies that impede medical help can't stand. Not here, not anywhere." Arthur sighed. "I'd be lying if I said I didn't worry about losing the appeal of this place. But I also can't stand by and watch this continue." He slipped a folded piece of paper into her hand. "These are some email exchanges I saved. Cynthia made it clear that she wanted every single visitor to pay something. She believed it would deter unwanted traffic. That included ambulances, if they weren't contracted with a private medical group. I never agreed with it, but, well, I didn't do enough to stop it." His voice trembled with guilt. Angela felt a lump in her throat. "Thank you for trusting me," she whispered. "I promise I'll use this responsibly." While their conversation unfolded, a small group across the lawn glared at them. Among them was Cynthia Shapiro, holding a plastic cup of lemonade so tightly her knuckles turned white. She locked eyes with Angela, her expression a mixture of contempt and defiance. It was as if she were silently saying, "You may have evidence, but I will not go down without a fight." Angela turned away, refusing to engage in a staring match. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the chatter around the park dissipated. A gentle breeze carried the scent of grilled hamburgers and charcoal, but the usual festive atmosphere was absent. Even the children, running around on the grass, seemed to sense the tension. Angela walked home, the new evidence in her purse feeling as heavy as a brick. If the board was willing to hide such crucial information, how much more was there to uncover? Days later, a surprising twist came. The city's district attorney announced they were reviewing the case for possible criminal charges. It wasn't just a civil negligence matter anymore. The DA's public statement read, "Any willful obstruction of emergency services is a serious concern to public safety. We are investigating whether the Clear Springs Estates HOA engaged in conduct that rises to criminal negligence or even manslaughter." Headlines exploded. A swirl of speculation followed. Would Cynthia and the other board members face actual jail time? For Angela, the swirl of events was exhausting but also invigorating. Perhaps her father's death would not be in vain. Maybe it would expose a deeper corruption, not just in Clear Springs Estates, but in other communities that favored money and exclusivity over human life. She pressed on, determined. The path ahead looked difficult, but she remembered her dad's unwavering smile. Whenever she felt like giving up, she recalled his gentle voice urging her to see things through, to stand up for what was right, even if it hurt. The day of the preliminary hearing dawned with a tense hush in the city's courthouse halls. Camera crews lined the sidewalk outside, while a small crowd of protesters, some supporting Angela, others backing the HOA, held signs that ranged from "Stop HOA Overreach" to "Don't Bankrupt Our Community." The media frenzy was at an all-time high, as news outlets from neighboring states also sent correspondents to cover this unprecedented legal battle. Angela arrived early, escorted by Malcolm Spencer and Ray Johnson. She clutched a photograph of her father in better times, finding solace in his warm grin. It was a reminder of why she was there. Smoothing her skirt nervously, she entered the courtroom, passing rows of curious onlookers and journalists tapping away at their devices. At the defendant's table sat Cynthia Shapiro and two other board members, flanked by their high-priced legal team. Arthur Gray was notably absent. Rumors said he'd resigned from the board, cooperating with the prosecution's investigation. The session began with an outline of the charges. On the civil side, Angela was seeking damages for wrongful death, citing that the HOA's policies directly caused Paul Gregg's medical care delay. The DA, for their part, was examining possible criminal negligence charges, an extremely rare angle in HOA cases. This wasn't just about a fine or a settlement. The board members faced the possibility of substantial penalties, even jail time, if found culpable of obstructing emergency services. Angela listened intently as Malcolm presented the new evidence, a trove of emails, financial statements, and testimonies from residents. She felt a surge of validation when the judge admitted these documents into evidence. Cynthia's expression was stoic, but the slight twitch at the corner of her mouth betrayed her discomfort. When it came time for the defense to respond, their lead attorney launched into a polished defense. The board's policies were standard practice. The fees in question applied only to commercial vendors, and the security guard acted independently, misunderstanding the rules in a tragic but isolated case. Malcolm skillfully dismantled those arguments, referencing the explicit line items labeled emergency services fee adjustments and the emails from Cynthia advocating fees for all non-registered vehicles, no exceptions. Sitting behind her attorney, Cynthia maintained a frozen expression, but Angela sensed cracks forming in the board's carefully constructed facade. Even the judge wore a visible frown, tapping a pen against the bench as he listened to the defense's increasingly strained explanations. At midday, the court recessed. Outside, a throng of reporters and curious residents buzzed with speculation about which way the judge might lean. Angela found a moment of peace in the corridor, leaning against a marble pillar to catch her breath. Ray Johnson gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "You're holding up well," Ray said. "Keep in mind this is just the beginning. They'll fight tooth and nail before admitting wrongdoing." Before Angela could respond, she saw Arthur Gray approaching. He looked thinner and more tired than before, but his eyes held a certain resolve. He gave her a sad smile. "I gave a statement to the DA," he said quietly. "Everything I know about how the board interpreted and enforced those rules. I thought I'd feel better finally telling the truth, but I just feel hollow." Angela touched his arm gently. "Thank you," she said. "You're doing the right thing." Arthur nodded, letting out a shaky breath before excusing himself. She watched him go, pity and gratitude mingling in her chest. When the hearing reconvened, the defense tried a new tactic, painting Paul Gregg's death as inevitable. They trotted out a medical expert who opined that, given the severity of a ruptured aneurysm, the 9-minute delay might not have changed the outcome. A hush fell over the courtroom. Angela's knuckles turned white as she gripped the table. She felt outrage boil within her at the suggestion her father was already doomed, as though his life were a mere footnote. But Malcolm was ready. He called the emergency room physician who treated Paul. Under oath, the doctor explained that while the situation was indeed critical, immediate intervention could have significantly raised Paul's survival chances. Every second counted. A 9-minute delay was catastrophic. By the end of the day, the judge declared there was enough evidence for the civil trial to proceed in full, and the DA's office indicated they were still deliberating on criminal charges based on the newly revealed financial documents and internal communications. The people in the courtroom collectively exhaled. For Angela, it was a victory, albeit a preliminary one. In the weeks that followed, the pressure on the HOA grew too intense to bear. Sponsors withdrew from planned neighborhood events. Prospective homebuyers backed out of deals, and even property management companies hesitated to handle Clear Springs estates. Under mounting internal strife, Cynthia Shapiro resigned, citing personal reasons. The board held a special election in which more moderate, reform-minded residents gained seats. The first motion they passed was the complete abolition of all gate fees, emergency or otherwise, and a mandate to train security personnel on prioritizing medical and public safety vehicles above all else. Word of these changes rippled through town. "It's about time," some residents muttered, relieved yet embittered by the cost it took, a man's life, to bring about these overdue reforms. Angela followed the developments closely, each new vote or policy shift reinforcing her conviction that she had done the right thing. While the civil trial was set for the coming months, it seemed likely the HOA's new leadership would seek a settlement rather than drag the case through a prolonged court battle. As for criminal charges, the DA's investigation continued behind closed doors, leaving the public to speculate on whether Cynthia or her allies would be indicted. Finally, after a grueling period of depositions and negotiations, Malcolm Spencer called Angela to his office for an update. She sat across from him, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly with every breath. "They're offering a settlement," Malcolm said, sliding a document across the desk. It was a sizable sum, but more crucially, it included enforceable stipulations: full transparency of HOA financial dealings for the next decade, mandatory staff retraining, and annual audits to ensure emergency procedures were never compromised again. Angela ran her fingers over the print, tears unexpectedly springing to her eyes. "This," Malcolm continued, "is how we ensure real change. They want to avoid trial, and they're willing to do just about anything to prevent further bad press." Angela nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. For a moment, she thought about turning it down, about making them face a jury. But she also recognized that real-world reforms often come through negotiation. Taking the settlement with these conditions might achieve a safer community more quickly than a protracted legal fight. And that was what mattered, preventing another tragedy like her father's. So, with a trembling hand, Angela signed her name. It felt like she was signing for her father, too, finishing a battle he didn't even know he was part of. That night, she stood under the porch light of the house Paul Gregg once called home, gazing at the gate in the distance, the gate that had once kept him from receiving help. The lights of an approaching ambulance, this time gliding through without resistance, symbolized a new beginning. In the end, people would remember Paul Gregg as the man whose death forced a community to confront its misguided priorities. Some still groused about the legalities, the settlement, the overshadowing of their idyllic neighborhood's reputation. But many, especially those old enough to recall simpler times, viewed the changes as a step toward restoring faith in both common decency and the real purpose of community, to stand by one another in sickness and in health. Angela reflected on her father's life and realized that his legacy would not be defined by the tragedy of his final moments, but by the improvements those moments spurred. "Sometimes," she whispered into the warm night, "it takes a terrible loss to wake people up," and she swore, silently, that she would keep fighting for the well-being of every resident in every gated community who deserved the right to live, free from fear that help could ever be turned away at the gate. The end.